Last week I did my first retro-focused video on Ars and Ellico Melody of Olemia, which I intended to make a series for this channel, and now here are 16 more retro JRPGs that are on my current list. This is by no means set in stone, as I intend to add more over time. And since I've mentioned the first game, it feels right that I kick the list off with the second Ars and Ellico Melody of Metaphalica. How the hell did they come up with these names? The first game didn't disappoint in the areas that I expected it to hit home in, those being the OST, the battle system, and the unique premise. Its sequel takes place a year and a half later after the canonical ending of the first game, but does have a few notable changes. First of all, the battle system looks completely different, splitting the turns into attacking and defending phases rather than going for the standard turn-based approach. The camera view has also changed to a more cinematic style, which I personally prefer as it gets me more in tune with the action, but I get the impression it's building on the positives that made the first game so good. And I've been told that in general, this one is even better than the original, as long as you play with a patched version, considering the initial translation was pretty bad. It all comes down to the patrons to decide when I'll get to play it, but if it does come up trumps on those voting polls, I won't be disappointed. Next up is the first Shadow Hearts game on the PlayStation 2, and luckily for me, the entire trilogy is on the same platform, so it falls within the bands of this retro series. That being, anything from the PS2 era and before is what I consider to be retro. However, I will mention first that if Shadow Hearts is chosen, I plan to play Koudelka first, the loosely defined prequel to the series that released back in 1997. It sets the groundwork for some of the elements found in Shadow Hearts, so I figure why not get the full story if it's available. Now, Shadow Hearts mainly piqued my interest following the crowdfunding success of Pennyblood, its spiritual successor. While I do enjoy fantasy settings, I'm a big fan of games that are set in the real world, in Shadow Hearts' case that being just before World War I. I'm intrigued to see how the real events of the war may translate into the story here. I was also enamoured with its eerie atmosphere. It had this undoubtedly Lovecraftian feel to it, at least from the footage I've seen, and its take on turn-based combat is a welcome approach, utilising a judgment ring system to increase effectiveness. And despite all that edge, it also appears to have sprinklings of humorous dialogue at points, which I am also a fan of, as long as it doesn't dilute the more serious scenes. And the final draw is that if the first game hits home, then I might be in for a treat with Covenant, which is considered to be the best in the series. Onto the GameCube now, and the one Fire Emblem game released for the platform. Many years ago I was introduced to this series via Radiant Dawn, which still holds a special place in my gaming journey, but I never knew that it was the latter half of a grander story, with Path of Radiance being the first part of this narrative. Now, while I have a feeling that some of the mechanics may feel dated when compared to the modern games, there's not much that can dilute the experience of a Fire Emblem title. Its core strategic gameplay is a staple, so I don't think it will take away too much. Rather, my interest, as it always is with JRPGs, comes in the story and characters, and Path of Radiance is lauded as one of the strongest on both fronts. I can still remember certain events from Radiant Dawn, and I'm hoping that this game will add further to the mythos of this particular subset, in particular delving more into the character of Ike and understanding how he became the beast he undoubtedly is come the events of Radiant Dawn. A PS1 classic now, and one I've had my eye on for a very long time. I, as many others, have experienced the wonderfully created universe of Xenoblade through its main trilogy, and it's only got me thirsting for more. So why not go back in time to the game that started it all for Takahashi, one of the titles considered the most influential of all time in the genre, that being Xenogears. Back during my Xenoblade retrospective, I read quite a bit into this game, how it was originally proposed as the story for Final Fantasy VII but was deemed too dark, how Squaresoft's 2-year development cycles worked at odds with the scale of the game, forcing it to release with its infamous Disc 2 as a compromise, and how it has one of the most gripping and involving stories even to this day. It touches on deep and profound themes throughout and is certainly a memorable experience for many who have played it. I'm just hoping that it will hold up in this day and age, and I can at least get a taste as to why it's held in such high regard. And since we've mentioned Xenogears, it makes sense to add the first episode of Xenosaga to that list as well. I'm a sucker for long-running stories that span multiple games, and I can't deny that Xenosaga has me waiting in anticipation simply for the potential of its story. One can only imagine how this would have turned out had Takahashi and Monolith Soft stuck with the original plan of 6 games, but I've heard that the narrative is concluded in a satisfactory manner here despite being cut in half. Xenosaga was, by all intents and purposes, a reboot of many ideas that Takahashi had for Xenogears, a revival for his vision after leaving Squaresoft. Some influences are thus taken from its predecessor, like the score composed by Yasunori Mitsuda, but it also stands strong on its own merit. Xenosaga, or at least the first game, was very much intended as a cinematic experience with over 8 hours of FMV cutscenes in that game alone, that were also lauded as decent quality for the time, but it's also praised for its flawed yet relatable cast, its solid gameplay, and indeed its futuristic setting that pulls on the imagination. Back to the PS1 now, and it's for Lunar Silver Star Story, the 1997 complete edition that followed on from the original in 1992. I'd rather play this version, to be honest. It's got sharper graphics, a recomposed OST, and FMV cutscenes along with no random encounters. It just seems like the superior option in every way. As for what drew me into adding Silver Star Story to the list, I can't really put my finger on it. It seems like your typical fantasy premise synonymous with that time period, but it just seems so polished compared to contemporaries, like a standard setter for games that followed. I'm fully expecting this game to have several aged features like archaic dungeon design and cumbersome inventory management, but people have praised its excellent cast of characters as a highlight of this journey, noting its particularly strong writing. It's also got a sense of scale with detailed NPC dialogue which rivals early Trails games in some regards. At the very least, it's a shorter game compared to many on this list, and thus if it doesn't hit home, it'll at least not overstay its welcome. Now on to a classic that JRPG fans can't help but hear about, at least in hushed whispers. I'm referring to the original Valkyrie profile on PS1. What hit me immediately was the awesome looking battle system. It looks so vivid and oozing in customization with the advent of the Einherjar. The setting also seems eerie, it's a world on the precipice of the end. This isn't your typical save the world adventure, you're actually looking to bring it to an end. A nice twist on the formula. The one thing I am worried about is its infamous obscurity at points. This is a game that many suggest you use a guide for simply because it's very easy to miss out on the best ending, typical of Tri-Ace titles in the early days. But if that combat stacks up, if the OST by Sakuraba hits home, and if that premise draws me in, I can't see any other result than me loving my time with it. Next up, well, I had to get involved with Atelier in some way, and I felt it was a good idea on this occasion to check out the first Manakemia title, Alchemists of Al Revis. By all intents, I could have checked out the first Iris game instead, but this one drew my attention more. Now first of all, the combat reminds me massively of Art and Ellico, and that's already a plus. The sprite work is very well animated, and it looks to be a game that focuses more on the gameplay. Time limits are also involved here, but they're noted as working very well on this occasion, giving you free time once you've completed the main objective, meaning you're not always under pressure until you choose to progress the story. Alchemy, of course, is still a big part of this game, but not as central as Atelier games normally are. This, along with Iris, were Gust's attempts at pushing the series to a more typical JRPG style, yet it didn't go down well commercially since, well, alchemy is what sets the series apart in the first place. Saying that, it's still important for progression. It has your typical staples as well, like an uninspired story, yet a decent cast of characters with their own unique arcs, which is perfectly fine by me. I don't play Atelier games to get deep narratives, I'm well aware that these are more character-focused adventures. On now to the world, or should I say the universe of Star Ocean, this time with Star Ocean The Second Story. So I've played 3 games in this series so far, 2 of them I liked and 1 of them I can't stand. So the series as a whole is still in the green, but I can't help but notice so many comments harkening back to Second Story in particular, stating that it remains the best in the series even to this day. The narrative is the highlight once again, a premise that starts small but eventually grows into something grand. The dual protagonist feature is back once again, and the pacing of the plot is also considered a notable strong point. Not to mention, private actions were introduced here for the first time. Once again, I might need a guide here for the optional recruitable characters and the notable difficulty spikes at points, but I'm feeling positive after Divine Force. Up to the pedestal next is Tales of the Abyss, the final game in the Holy Trinity that I have yet to play. I enjoyed one, and I didn't like the other, so unlike Star Ocean, this is the make or break title. But I'm confident in Abyss, as many fans of the series consider this game to have some of the best character development in any JRPG when referring to the protagonist Luke. The story, on the other hand, is noted as interesting in scope, but the general consensus is that it has jumbled pacing, especially as you get further into the game, so the jury's out there. But in my head, this main argument prevails. Those who enjoyed Symphonia, like me, have a very good chance of enjoying Abyss, as it's pretty much an upgrade to the formula of Symphonia in many ways, with its less restrictive battle system and cleaner visuals. To the Game Boy Advance now, and a notable JRPG created by Camelot in Golden Sun, released in 2001. Now from what I've seen, this game has a strong focus on puzzles, which I'll admit is not my cup of tea, but I was drawn into its battle system, the rotating camera that somehow added more impact to the fight, its integration of djinns as a mechanic, and of course the OST composed once again by Motoi Sakuraba. Now Golden Sun of course came out for the Game Boy Advance, and as such some have pointed to hardware limitations leaking onto this experience, namely its slower dialogue, dialogue going to less words per text box and very linear story. In fact, from what I've read, the story is not a highlight at all, and it mainly falls to the gameplay. Out of all the games on this list, Golden Sun is the one I am most cautious about. I have a feeling that its status was more a product of its time rather than its quality, but I'm still open to trying it out and hopefully being proved wrong. Okay, I lied. Golden Sun is not the one I'm most cautious about, it's actually this one, Vagrant Story. I can see it now, there will be no in-between with this game. I will either love it or absolutely despise it. What drew me into Vagrant Story was its mature premise. It's got the atmosphere down just like Shadow Hearts, and I was floored by the lack of music at many points. It actually fit quite well from what I've seen. However, the gameplay. It looks good with the whole targeting different body parts as a core feature, but I'm worried about that menu switching. It looks frustrating even from just watching, and I get the impression there's a fair degree of trial and error here as well. If anything, it's got that early feel of a Souls-like title in certain regards, mostly referring to its difficulty and lack of hand-holdings, and I'm all for that, but there is a way to execute on that premise, and I'm just not sure if Vagrant Story will be able to do that. Either way, I'll never know unless I try. Flipping the table completely now, we move from foreboding to just straight up dumb, and it's the 1998 release of Thousand Arms for PS1, a game that was developed by Red Entertainment and overseen by Oji Hiroi, who some will know as the mastermind behind Sakura Wars. And that's enough to pique my interest. I love the reboot of Sakura Wars, so more in the same vein is always a plus. Now, as suggested there, this is a turn-based RPG with action elements, but of course it also has a dating sim mechanic. You get to go on dates, make choices and all that jazz, which makes your weapon stronger, or something like that. What I will say immediately though is that I was laughing, not at it, but with this game. The dialogue at certain points that I saw was great, breaking the fourth wall, not taking itself too seriously, it just looks like a fun game. I'm not expecting it to be a memorable experience in many ways, in that I'll probably forget the story 10 minutes after I finish it, but I am hoping it will at least be a good palate cleanser and make me smile. Right, now this next one is really skirting the line on retro, but I'm gonna make an exception because I just really want a justification for playing it, and it's for Radiant Historia, released in 2010 for the DS, though I will also bend the rules even more and play the 3DS version instead because that has more content in it. I don't care, I want to play the best version. The whole premise of Radiant Historia is that there are parallel timelines, and with the use of the White Chronicle, our main protag can bounce between them to progress in each, sort of like a ReZero concept. It's pretty cool that this game actively meddles in the timelines while many contemporaries have the standard fare of going back to the past and or forward to the future. The combat also looks really cool, a 3x3 grid where you attempt to push enemies to a single square for massive damage. That points to a good deal of planning and forethought required from the player. And I'm not one to mention graphics often, but damn, this game looks good. I know the 3DS had some beautiful RPGs like Fire Emblem Awakening and Etrian Odyssey Untold: The Millennium Girl, but this definitely stands equal to them. I'm really looking forward to trying this one out. Talking about games I'm really looking forward to, next up is a Dragon Quest game some hold as the best of Yuji Horii work, that being DQ5 Hand of the Heavenly Bride. Now, while I did enjoy DQ11, it was never because of the story or characters, it was because it was comfortable. It was for the most part a feel-good adventure in many respects with an amazing amount of polish. But it never grew on me narratively, and I was hoping there would be a Dragon Quest game that could take that mantle. And after some research, my eyes set on Dragon Quest V for the DS, that being the remake of the original 1992 release. I've heard that the story in this game plays out like some sort of epic poem, a relatable adventure that spans the entirety of the protagonist's life with some truly profound and heartfelt moments within. It also shakes up the formula by allowing you to recruit monsters this time around, a welcome change in approach. Dragon Quest V makes this list purely from reputation. It's lauded by many as the best in the series, and I can't go wrong with at least giving it a go. And speaking of best in the series, as according to fans, the last game on this list comes from Capcom, and it is for Breath of Fire 3, released in 1997 for the PS1. Now, I'm not expecting perfection from this game. In fact, I'm anticipating a fair amount of jank here and there, as I am with other games on this list, but I get the impression that Breath of Fire 3 is at least a very solid JRPG across the entire spectrum. The pixel art still holds up even now, it looks great, and the animation is on point, and the battle system looks very engaging, especially with the advent of the Dragon Gene mechanic, which gives the player a degree of freedom in terms of progression. I'm not too sold on that OST, I must say. The jazzy style has only worked on me once, and that was with Persona 5 Royal, but from what I've seen, that's the only thing that's sticking out as a potential negative. The rest of it looks, at least, decent, and with the amount of praise this game gets, I'd be a fool to not put it on the retro backlog. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe for more JRPG content, and consider joining my Patreon if you're interested. Peace.